Thank you so much, and I'm delighted to be here to join in this celebration for Lisa. In December 2001, Lisa was interviewed by U.S. Catholic to discuss the moral implications of the then newly engaged in war in Afghanistan. Lisa's almost prescient concerns and her use of just war theory are a fitting place to ground a discussion on Lisa's contribution to war and peacemaking and to find ways to look to take her thought forward. Especially on today, the 20th anniversary of 9/11, just days after the U.S. has left Afghanistan after a grueling 20-year war. The interview brought together two strands of Catholic thought on war, with Lisa representing the just war side and Father Michael Baxter of Notre Dame representing the pacifist side. If they had initially hoped to have these thinkers duel it out, they were sorely mistaken, because Lisa was not going to give them any of that or any warmongering. Just war theory in the Christian tradition is a way to determine when war might be appropriate. The early Christians were mostly pacifist, impelled by Jesus' exhortation to love the enemy and to turn the other cheek. Pacifism was an obvious expression of Christian love. But once Christians gained power, and consequently responsibility, how to live out the demands of the Sermon on the Mount were not as clear. Pacifism, essentially, was untenable given the obligations that come along with caring for an entire body politic. The challenge for Augustine, who influentially takes up this problem, is how to reconcile the possibility of war with Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. As Lisa adeptly shows, first in Love Your Enemies in 1994, and more recently in Blessed Are the Peacemakers in 2019, as well as elsewhere, this, at times, has involved some moves that are in tension. Rooting himself in the priority of love and well-ordered loves, along with a belief in the possibility for some semblance of peace in the earthly city, Augustine proposes two approaches to justifying war. On the one hand, war is like loving punishment, he says, akin to the father who punishes his son. On the other hand, Augustine seems to admit that war isn't so loving because he tells Faustus that in the case when war is required, it is following the Sermon on the Mount as an inner disposition, not an outer disposition. So when it appears as if the Christian is not following the Sermon on the Mount on the outside by engaging in violence, Augustine assures us the Christian is in fact following the Sermon on the Mount on the inside. This begs the question for Lisa and her readers, why is war relegated to an interior disposition if it is loving? While perhaps an imperfect approach, Augustine's concern for libido dominandi, lust for domination, do lead him to address some restrictions in war, which Lisa highlights. When Aquinas takes this up, Lisa explains that he focuses his analysis on war justified for the common good, the common weal. As Lisa points out, Aquinas wonders in the Summa under the question of charity whether it is always sinful to go to war, the presumption being it is usually sinful to go to war, but perhaps it can occasionally be justified. To deal with the challenge posed by the Sermon on the Mount, Aquinas claims that clerics cannot fight in war, but other Christians can. As Lisa points out, this seems an odd distinction. If war really did fulfill the demands of charity, why would we need this distinction? And she draws out tensions in Aquinas' claims that intentional killing in war is permissible, but private killing must be unintentional, according to Aquinas' question on killing in self-defense. Augustine and Aquinas put forward the basic premise of Christian just war theory with their somewhat different reasonings, but their shared criteria of what makes a war just. These become known as jus ad bellum, the justice of going to war, and these criteria, first articulated by Augustine and then adopted by Aquinas, are legitimate authority, right intention, and just cause. Contemporary just war theory adds to these criteria jus ad bellum, the justice in war, which include they add to this criteria proportionality, reasonable success, and last resort, as well as jus in bello criteria, justice in war, which considers non-combatant immunity and proportionality, as well as jus post bellum, justice after war. Just war theory has many detractors. Stanley Hauerwas, for instance, has provocatively argued for Christian pacifism based on the notion that a Christian just war theory is nonsensical in light of Jesus' example of the cross and his statements around nonviolence. Others have argued that just war theory has been used to encourage war, more like a checklist that makes way for war. Lisa appreciates the pacifist impulses, and over her career she comes to regard pacifism as a genuine expression of the Gospels arising from the experience of conversion and aligned with Jesus' message. The strength of pacifism, in her view, is its fidelity to the Gospels. Despite this praise, Lisa makes a major contribution to pacifist studies by arguing that pacifism is unfeasible at times. For instance, she reflects on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a pacifist, but who was part of a movement to assassinate Hitler. And she explains that Dorothy Day viewed pacifism as the best way of living out gospel values in her concrete reality, but supported the Cuban Revolution to the dismay of many. Lisa's Christian approach to just war is rooted in firstly reclaiming the thought of its early pioneers, Augustine and Aquinas, and then secondly, an appreciation of the Christian pacifist position. Her Augustinian realism leads her to defend the usefulness of the just war tradition in light of our fallen world, and her Thomistic optimism leads her to hope for something better, even if it is not achievable now. As a result, Lisa's approach to just war and her contribution to a just war theory is one that constrains war. Lisa skillfully addresses concerns of just war critics when she uses the wisdom of the tradition to examine war and restrain violence in that interview on the war in Afghanistan. Using the just war criteria to critically question war, Lisa interrogates U.S. motivations in terms of just war's criteria of right intention. She points out that bombing residential areas in Afghanistan undermines just war's commitment to non-combatant immunity. And she questions whether the bombings the U.S. employed were really proportionate. She encourages us to look at protecting the common good in terms of the whole international community, not only American interests. And she wonders if war was a last resort or whether the U.S. could have advanced alternative routes, such as negotiations or the International Court of Justice. And rather presciently, she questions what hope for success looks like and how we are going to get there, arguably an aim the U.S. never meaningfully contended with. Far from what critics fear of just war theory, Lisa uses just war to limit war, and instead of throwing it out, she sees it as serving an important function, especially when it is rehabilitated by the thought of Augustine and Aquinas. 20 years later, now only just having left Afghanistan, Lisa's use of just war and her awareness of the problems at play are a useful starting point for examining this 2-decade-long war. There are immediate humanitarian crises that need to be addressed in Afghanistan: food shortages, COVID concerns, the Taliban's treatment of women. The current situation raises questions about what peace looks like, if peace is more than just not war, and what the goals and understandings of peace ever were for Afghanistan. But Lisa's thought has evolved since that interview. Over her career, Lisa becomes increasingly concerned about the tensions in both just war theory and pacifism, leading her in her more recent work to claim moral ambiguity around both killing and refusing to kill, and the tragedies that both just war theorists and pacifists are involved in. As a result, she comes to critique both just war theory and pacifism for ignoring irreducible moral dilemmas. She defines this as no matter what the agent does, even if it's on the whole right, he or she will still be implicated in wrongdoing. In a moral dilemma, one ought to do A and one ought to do B, but one can't do both. In a tragic dilemma, these are particularly tragic situations. I find tragic dilemmas particularly compelling. Dilemmas are highly debated in moral philosophy and generally denied in theology because what good God would put us in a situation where there's no right action? Lisa argues that the existence of irreducible moral dilemmas is supported by the inherent ambivalences and tensions within the thought of both just war thinkers and pacifists, as we have seen. It is no surprise that Lisa has landed on this dilemma conundrum. Throughout her career, Lisa develops various approaches to dealing with hard cases. In her early work on sexual ethics, Lisa implements sinning bravely for those times when the best course of action is also considered a sin. Later, in theological bioethics, Lisa introduces adverse virtues to address those times that the principle of double effect falls short. The concept arises out of a discomfort she has over a bioethics case from the Philippines. When a mother is reluctant to remove a costly ventilator of her 17-year-old son, who is being kept alive at a financial cost the family cannot endure, the principle of double effect is used to ensure that the right decision is being made when the apparatus is removed. Lisa harshly criticizes the principle of double effect used in this way, saying that it is not only futile, but inhumane. She worries about how the principle of double effect obscures societal injustices that place agents in difficult situations. And a possible implication of her critique is that the principle of double effect can even at times perpetuate injustices because society does not have to confront problems when individual agents are giving a way out of hard cases. Lisa offers adverse virtues as an alternative approach. Adverse virtues are enacted when there are no virtuous means and when right action seems to fall short of flourishing. The force of this concept is twofold. It firstly names and indicts unjust social structures that compel agents to act in difficult situations. And secondly, it underscores that right action is still possible. It is also no surprise that Lisa focuses on the concept of irreducible moral dilemmas, an idea that circles around the complexity of conflicting obligations, given the many obligations in Lisa's own life. I know many of us have shared admiring glances as Lisa strutted off to make dinner for her family after the Tuesday 4:30 p.m. Major Figures seminar, or let out sighs of appreciation when she so quickly printed and returned a dissertation chapter with incisive comments handwritten on the margins, while also working on her own article, book, plenary talk, and prepping for one of her infamous parties. When writing on a similar topic, conflicts and tragedy, Martha Nussbaum describes the mini-tragedy of having to attend a regular Harvard philosophy department colloquium at the same time she had to pick up her kids and make dinner. While I am sure Lisa must have faced many similar situations and mini-tragedies, not due to poor departmental planning, of course, they somehow were never so tragic for her. How she does it all, I will never know. And yet, as a scholar and mentor, she is so attuned to others' personal tragedies and difficult conflicts. How many of us have sought her sage advice and benefited from her realistic, yet also demanding, approach to doctoral studies? Her attention to moral complexity, along with her genuine concerns for the challenges of real life, are what make her and her scholarship so compelling. This comes out in the interview about Afghanistan, where she describes holding her students' grief and at the same time challenging them to see the suffering in Afghanistan and the additional suffering that a military intervention may impose. It is no surprise that after 9/11, U.S. Catholic calls on Lisa to help make sense of what is going on. I know many of us have done the same in our personal lives. In Blessed Are the Peacemakers, Lisa recognizes just war's ability to address sin pacifism's fidelity to the Gospels, but she is also attuned and attentive to the complexity and suffering and shortcomings of these approaches, and so she turns to peacemaking. Peace building shifts the focus from just war and pacifism to show how Christians can make a practical difference. While not immune to dilemmas, peace building aims to transform societies by creating just structures that put an end to conflict while affirming human dignity and finding ways to heal from war. Peace building is an act of hope in a world wounded by sin. Peace building is visionary, and peace building is consensus building. As such, it requires the cooperation of many groups, Christians and non-Christians, secular and religious. Lisa accommodates this by retrieving Thomistic thought, affirming that humans share some fundamental inclinations and basic goods. This retrieval serves as the basis for how constituents can work together to bring about shared goals in the pursuit of peace. This turn to peace building highlights Lisa's commitment to building up the common good, a task which will be necessary to do in Afghanistan as well. In the interview about Afghanistan, while still reeling with the effects of 9/11 and at the beginning of the war, amid suffering, death, uncertainty, and sadness, Lisa responds with hope based on the great responsibility that Christians have in caring for the world and the possibilities this engenders. Lisa says, "I'm saying that it is possible and worthwhile to change society, and that Catholics and Christians should be active participants in that task in the hope that we can bring about some good. I'm not overly optimistic either that the whole world is ultimately going to become one just cooperative society, but I would want to see us get out there and participate and do what we can. This, building up the common good and participating to bring about peace, is a challenge and task for all of us who have learned so much from Lisa." Thank you.